So this week it's Into the Forest, and into Richard Powers' wide-ranging novel, The Overstory, which has an undercurrent in it, which says from the very beginning of the novel, listen, there's something you need to hear. One of the challenges of this novel, right, is to kind of rethink its subject. What is Powers after, as he writes? Is in all of his novels, there's a distinct kind of desire to open the reader's imagination, and here it is to kind of reconnect the reader to environment and to kind of open the reader's environmental imagination. And as with all of Powers' novels, how we tell the story is a central kind of problem here. How does our standard sense of narrative conventions like character and plot, how do those work when you try to open conversation about environmental issues? Can you talk about nature as plot? Can you think about trees as character? And in terms of plot, as Powers notes within this novel, through Patricia's consciousness, is that she realizes that all of the drama of the world is gathering underground in the kind of decay and breakdown and the communications among fungi there. That this natural world has complexities that human beings are only beginning to imagine, and Powers' novel imagines them with us here. The ways in which art can kind of engage the reader or viewer's imagination can be pretty powerful. And in terms of local experience, I'm reminded of the architect Jeannie Gang and her work on the Chicago River and trying to develop natural spaces or to reclaim natural spaces along the river itself. Amidst the efforts at cleanup, environmental activists wanted to kind of reawaken people's sense of connection, and Gang says that she began to realize, right, that the only way people really began to connect is if they found ways in which to directly utilize the river and become part of its space. And so as an architect, she developed this boathouse that allowed people to start to row on the river, and began to see how people, by using the river and utilizing the river, how they began to kind of connect to it and to begin to care for it and to realize its importance, and to kind of awaken a political imagination about the environmental issues in saving the river. And so does Powers' novel also have that kind of sense of purpose to it? In what ways does it reconnect us to a human imagination of the environment and our place within it? When you think about the Overstory as an ecological novel, and here we see a chestnut tree and a man standing against a chestnut tree from late in the 19th century. There's a sense in which, in what ways do these characters' kind of journeys force them into a deeper ecology? In what ways do they come to connect with forest in ways that they hadn't previously thought? And in terms of our focus here, in what ways does the forest and its ends connect them to their own ends? In what ways do they measure themselves, the characters and their journeys? What ways do they measure themselves against the tree's kind of larger sense of tick-tock in this novel? As they begin to connect themselves to the forest and to realize its complexities, they begin to take on new senses of meaning within life. As it says from the very beginning, every piece of earth needs a new way to grip it. Signals rain down on the woman like seeds. That meanings develop as they connect themselves to this forest space. And one of the things, as in all Powers novels, is how do you tell about? How do you find ways to write about, and how do you tell these new stories? In an interview, he notes that there's kind of this is kind of a reawakening of a particular kind of way of talking about literature, that inherent conflict between the human being and nature itself. How does Powers' novel redefine that conflict for us? Is a good question you might think about as you wade into this novel. You think about all the ways in which characters rethink that basic story and their own sense of stories here. Various examples here from the first part of the novel, or, for example, the whole photographs of the chestnut tree. In what ways does its story kind of push out human stories in the Iowa landscape, right? As Frank looks through the photographs, he has a sense that everything a human being might call the story happens outside his photo's frame, against this kind of relentless presence of this Iowa chestnut tree, a tree that's not supposed to be there, in terms of its natural range, but it has story that seems central here. In what ways does Winston Ma say to his daughter as they run away from a bear, right? He has his own sense of story here, right? And purpose and destiny, as he says to her as they escape the bear. And she says, "Weren't you scared?" He says, "Not my time yet, not my story," to end there. So characters have a strong sense of individual journey and story that is disrupted in some ways here by the natural world. Adam Appich watches ants crawl up his leg and along his arm, and he studies them as they do. He says, patterns reveal themselves as he watches, and they're wild. The colony possesses something. Adam doesn't know what to call it. Purpose, will, a kind of awareness. So he awakens to a sense of what is the force that drives the non-human world, as in its kind of basic purposes and drives. And then Nile Mehta has this terrifying sense, as he looks into the natural world and thinks about the end here of individual human beings, that he comes to the realization that something slow and purposeful wants to turn every human being into soil, as Powers calls it, the rich brown batter of soil, right? The amalgamation of deaths that becomes the stuff from which life grows in the forest. And so all of these stories, kind of reawaken the character's sense of place and purpose. Particularly, this is true of the centrality of Patricia Westerford's journey as she comes to understand the forest and its ways of communicating. That she travels with her father through the woods, and as Powers notes, she alone of all the family sees what her father knows, that plants are willful and crafty and after something, just like people. People have no corner on curious behavior. Other creatures, bigger, slower, older, and more durable, call the shots, make the weather, feed creation, and create the very air. So she connects us to the tree's purpose from the very beginning, in a very kind of visceral way, that she has a secret suspicion, Powers writes. She's sure on no evidence whatsoever that trees are social creatures. It's obvious to her. Motionless things grow in mass, mixed communities, and must have evolved ways to synchronize with one another. So she has a strong sense that the trees are communicating on a very basic level, that they, have a sense of force and will and drive, and that they communicate this to one another in the forest, where, as Powers writes on 142, everything is forest. And this becomes Westerford's kind of central vision that drives her developing sense of forest throughout the novel. The question is, like, when you think about Westerford's journey and the journeys of all the characters in this novel, right? Does nature writing itself, does the ecological novel have an inherent political bend to it in the end? Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement writes that about the failure of politicization of climate change as a particular subject. That the more that we talk about climate change and the more we think about it politically, the less we seem capable of doing. In the end, does nature writing have a similar political bend to it, and in what ways does narrative perhaps offer us a means of understanding the changes here? Adam Appich has this realization where he thinks the humankind is deeply ill, the species won't last long. Soon the world will be returned to the healthy intelligences, the collective ones, colonies and hives. That Adam has this revelation of humankind's end, that it's short-sighted and that it is disappearing from the planet. In what ways does that connect or drive us in our ecological imaginations? In the characters' journeys, in what ways does their sense of human ends awaken this sense in them as well? As they go west, how do they see a sense of how capital has redefined the landscape? In what ways has it kind of caused them to rethink human ends here, right? The Hulls, as their farm disappears, they come to an awareness, right, that each year another neighbor is swallowed up into the massive, managed, relentlessly productive monocrop economy. The Iowa earth has been brought to its rationalized end. That farming becomes not so much a natural enterprise in the end, in their realization, but it becomes kind of just one more space of factory floor of production for capital. In the same way that Douglas Pavlicek, comes to a realization in his journey as he's planting trees, right, that logging interests in the ways in which they have reshaped the landscape, that is also a part of human end that's developing in the novel, and where he realizes that one of human beings' greatest flaws is their ability to mistake agreement for truth. And all this kind of works together, towards a kind of a larger political drive here, perhaps, where as Patricia Westerford realizes, right, the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. That is the thing that reveals to human beings their sense of place in this great universe, and is perhaps the center of Power's novel as it begins.